Protection Helpline. You're speaking with Sonia.
Describe the house to me.
The father threw the mother across the room.
Child abuse can be defined as behaviors and treatment that result in harming the child or young person. This can include physical abuse or emotional abuse or sexual abuse.
Child protection can be defined as a sector that focuses on protecting individual children that have been identified as suffering or at significant harm. In New South Wales, child protection is called the Department of Communities and Justice, often known as DCJ. The pandemic has shown a light on the conventional way that child protection works and the clear gaps that can be seen. In 2019 to 2020, about 174,700 children aged between 0 to 17 received child protection services in Australia. This has rose by 3.8% since 2016. Statistics also show that certain groups of children are consistently overrepresented in the child protection system in Australia. This includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, who are almost 8 times likely as non-Indigenous children to have received child protection services. Infants under the age of 1 are more likely to receive child protection services than those aged between 15 to 17. Children from geographically remote areas had the highest rate of substantiations. Children who were subjects of substantiations were more likely to be from lower socio-economic areas. Conventional social work practice is often defined as maintaining the status quo. It often focuses on the individual and looking at the symptoms that the individual is presenting with and the interventions that aim to respond to these presenting symptoms. Child protection has often been seen as a matter of risk management and not risk elimination. The functionalist model provides for good understanding in the progression of the current work for child protection practice. The functionalist model focuses on how society, such as institutions, roles, norms, etc., serve a purpose and are crucial for the long-term survival of the society. The service-orientated model aims for the service and or case-based interventions. These interventions are formed from Western cultured values and ideas of individuals in the child protection system, which are required to be compliant to the directives put forward to access the initial supports and then sustain them over the long-term period. There is clear gaps in the functionalist and service-orientated models, especially when working with marginalised and disadvantaged communities. The critical social work approaches have a focus on power and look at how power is dispersed and reinforced in society and in communities. These critical approaches aim to look at the innovative, disruptive, and creative practices that can address oppression and overall focus on social change and social justice. The critical approaches we are going to look at today is human rights framework, feminist theory, and anti-oppressive model.
Moving on to human rights framework. Well, it proposed protection of children from violence and neglect, because like every other human being, the children have right to live, survive, and thrive. There has been reported a substantial increase in the number of child injuries reported at Trauma Center in Maryland, United States of America, and there was increased time spent at home. Makes children more vulnerable to domestic violence as well as child abuse. Child protection in an increasingly complex and pluralistic nation-state systems needs actually an interventionist strategy rather than a top-down approach. So, according to human rights theory, this calls for a direct state intervention, since this can be justified in terms of child's best interest. If we look into human rights approach to case study, then we can see that there has been increased abuse on children. Increased abuse on children makes them more vulnerable to long-term physical as well as emotional harm. And improving community collaboration to provide greater protection to children is a relatively new approach in both theory and practice of human rights, according to Ife and Fiske in 2006. It promises good result in scenario where state interventionist agencies are burdened by workload and scarce resources. Authors suggest a community-driven approach to deal with this problem, which contrasts with the pluralistic view, as it does places more emphasis on the community welfare approach.
One of the critical theories is feminist theory. Feminist theory developed as a professional theory for challenging patriarchal gender role division in work with families and analyzing and disputing gender power relations in group work. Feminism emphasized the importance of the social, political, and economic structure that shape human societies and stressed that Gender must be considered when examining the effects of oppression and domination and power and powerlessness in our society. This theory views child abuse as closely related to the impact of patriarchal power relations. Feminist social work is based upon the desire to change societal structure so that women will no longer be oppressed and will further develop a sense of self-efficacy, self-esteem and self-confidence as a path of claiming power. Their goal is to move away from focusing on individual changes as a path to achieving an enhanced sense of well-being and move toward systematic change in our social, political and economic system with the goal of achieving a more equal distribution of resources and power. The aim of feminist social work is to improve women and children's well-being by linking their personal situations with their social position and status in society. Now, some of the questions often asked by feminist analyses are: what about the women? What are women doing and how are they represented in this situation? What roles do they play and why? How are they positioned in relation to men? What is expected of women that is not expected of men, and harms arise as a result of this different positioning? These questions have a major impact on social work practice. The use of feminist theory critiques the patriarchal oppression to create alternatives to the ideal of where gender is no longer oppressive or damaging. As a social worker, using critical theories such as human rights, feminism, and anti-oppressive theory can be used together in a way that strengthens practitioner analysis of complex situations. Social work responses to violence against women and children needs to have the feminist approach in mind, which include link the personal with political. This is done by acknowledging the role of gender and power which produces family violence, facilitate structural change that address the social, economic and the political disadvantages of women, acknowledge the personal problems that women experience as a legitimate response to oppression. And it is also important that the organizational responses respond to not only the trauma that the woman experiences but also addressing to women's needs and rights.
The anti-oppressive model analyzes and advocates against socio-economic oppression and emphasizes social justice and social change through empowerment. As social workers, it is our moral, ethical, and legal responsibility to challenge inequality and disadvantage. In anti-oppressive practice, social workers have the viewpoint that personal experiences are inseparably linked to and determined by social, cultural, political, and economic relationships within their specific historical and geographical situations. Through this, social workers can challenge those who view individuals by their race, gender, or class, failing to understand that it is the interconnectedness between the social divisions to which one belongs that defines who the person truly is. Applying this to the case study, Larson 2008 suggests 7 principles to build a framework that guides anti-oppressive practice in child protection. 1. Include parents and families as full participants in the identification and implementation of the services that they receive, as well as the goals and strategies applied in resolving the problem. 2. Use empowering and respectful language as the base of communication when speaking with parents and or families. 3. Be mindful and respectful of Indigenous practices and strategies. 4. Establish a fair and collaborative working relationship based on trust and power sharing. 5. Promote education and professional development among child protection peers to enhance awareness of individual and institutional preconceptions, including discriminatory and oppressive attitudes and practices. 6. Promote cultural diversity and incorporate a strength-based perspective that acknowledges the parents and or families' intrinsic capacity to make choices and changes. 7. Promote social justice, not just in intellectual awareness of injustice, but also transforms into action to challenge and reform oppressive practices that impact upon parents and their children. For social workers, honest self-reflection has been identified as a key aspect in their development of anti-oppressive practice. However, challenges exist. It has been suggested that a challenge facing anti-oppressive practices is that the debates and perspectives informing such practices reflect the views of academics and practitioners instead of the lived experiences of oppressed individuals and groups.
We are now going to meet Ellie and her family. Ellie and her partner Mike have 5 children aged between 14 to 27. In the past 25 years, child protection have been involved with the family. Due to physical abuse, neglect and carer concern, there has also been reports around domestic violence. In May 2021, a notification was made around a safety concern due to feces being in the house. During the assessment stage at the family's house, the child protection workers went through all the reports that had been made in the last 20 years. Ellie and her 16-year-old daughter were present throughout the interview. They felt quite interrogated by the workers. After the meeting, the child protection caseworker stated they would be involved for 2 months and they would be expecting changes, and that they would be coming around the house weekly and would also be communicating with schools and other services. Lockdown in New South Wales started mid-June. The child protection workers tried to arrange visits, but the family wasn't willing to due to COVID risk concerns. The child protection workers did the rest of the check-ins via phone calls. The child protection caseworkers told Ellie that she needed to agree to referrals for family services and youth services. Ellie stated that she didn't think that would be necessary, as she had been through a lot of services in the past and she hasn't found them helpful. After multiple calls from the caseworker trying to convince Ellie to agree to referrals, Ellie started to ignore calls. The child protection worker then called a caseworker from a youth service who had previously worked with Ben. The caseworker stated that she no longer worked with the 14-year-old boy, as he felt his goals were completed and no longer wanted support. The child protection worker said that she needed to call Ellie and to make her to agree to referrals for herself and her children. The caseworker said she felt uncomfortable calling Ellie out of the blue and then telling her she needed to accept support, when Ellie had previously said that the suggestions weren't going to be helpful. The child protection caseworker got her manager involved in the conversation. The manager stated that his family needed supports in place.
In the above case example, we will be looking at how the critical theories mentioned above will support child protection's response and also support in empowering Ellie and her family. Issues that can be seen in this case include Ellie's voice was not heard. Ellie and her family's strengths were never mentioned. The child protection workers brought up past reports, creating a power imbalance. Ellie and her daughter felt interrogated. Child protection workers didn't take time to focus on what Ellie and her family were needing support with during the pandemic. In the above case example, we will be looking at how the critical theories mentioned above will support child protection's response and also support in empowering Ellie and her family. If we look at it through a human rights framework, there is an importance to build continuity of care and protection in all stages of the crisis. This could be discussing with Ellie on what support she is needing in the house to get rid of the feces. Also discussing with Ellie on local support around that is helping with food, finances, etc., such as Anglicare's food and financial support in Liverpool. Although there are many factors that put children at risk for experiencing violence and needing protection, there are also numerous protective factors that have the potential to mitigate and prevent these risks. In this case study, we need to look at it with the anti-oppressive theory in mind. Looking at last in 2008, 7 principles can support in the children and families taking control of what is going on in their lives. This can be through including children and parents in identifying and implementing the support they can see that they are needing. This would allow Ellie to identify the needs that she is wanting support with during the pandemic, to ensure that phone calls are also empowering and respectful, and that communication is clear and transparent. Lastly, looking at it through the feminist framework, there is importance to look at power imbalances, as this is often a trait in domestic violence towards women. As a social worker, it's important to listen and allow Ellie to be heard. Also to acknowledge the personal problems that Ellie and her daughter have experienced as a legitimate response to oppression. It's also important to respond to not only trauma that Ellie has experienced, but also addressing her needs and rights. Offering Ellie alternative options to formal service delivery, such as connecting Ellie with her community. During lockdown, this could be supporting Molly and Ben to connect with youth services that are providing online fun workshops, such as Core Youth Services Kahoot competitions or Junction Works online drop-ins. Mission Australia and Miller were also offering parent drop-ins where parents could join and just connect with other adults. Another program running during lockdown was a cook and catch-up session where mothers could make lunch whilst chatting and laughing with friends.
Always a chance that this might be enough to break the cycle. So that's where my hope lies.